about a Scottish fisherman who was an atheist. And he was out on the rugged coast of Scotland, and he was used to braving the hard seas and hauling in his catch of fish, and he thought, I don't need God, I'm totally independent as I am. But one day, the fish along the coast started to dry up, and his livelihood was starting to dwindle. So someone told him, you need to change from ocean fishing to lake fishing. And you might need a different set of equipment and some other things, but boy, the fish in the lake are mighty fine. And they are teeming with fish and with life. You should do this. The only thing is, you have to brave the Loch Ness Monster because it's Loch Ness Lake. Well, the Scottish fisherman said, argh, that's never mind to me. I don't believe in monsters. Phooey. So he got his boat and he got his new lake fishing equipment and he went to the lake, and at first all was pristine and calm. Then suddenly the waters started to churn and they started to grow dark, and this ugly monster head rose up from out of the depths, and his tail came up and lifted the man high into the water, and just when he thought he would perish, he said, God, help me! And God froze him in midair and said, I thought you didn't believe in me. And he said, well, give me a break, God. I didn't believe in the Loch Ness Monster either. Now, this might seem like a silly story, but it reminds us that sometimes change can be kind of a scary thing. And we might have to face those sort of monsters in the depths and the mysterious dark that we're not sure that we know how to handle. But what we need in those times is to reach out to God, to depend on God, to ask God for help, because that is really where our source of comfort and help will come from. And as Lorraine said, our theme this morning is transitions, in part because the Reverend Renee Rico was our speaker at the retreat, and that is what we talked about. Of course, here at PCC, we'll be looking at transitions as well. So I want us to go a little bit deeper with this topic. And to begin, I'd like us to go a little bit deeper into these texts, particularly the text from Jeremiah this morning. And I had Kevin actually back up a little bit from chapter 12, because when we back up into the last few verses of chapter 11, we see the context out of which this story, this famous call to Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai, comes. What we notice is there's a lot of commentary about his father, Terah. And he had already felt this call to go from Ur to Canaan. He was actually on his way to Canaan until they got to Hanan and decided to settle there. Looked pretty cozy, looked pretty comfortable. Sure, we'll just hunker down, we'll settle here. Well, we like it, it sounds good. But that wasn't part of God's plan. God wanted them to keep going. God wanted them to complete the journey and get all the way to the end. So it is in this context that God calls Abram and Sarah. But we have to remember, it's not a brand new vision. It's a continuation of the vision and the journey that had already begun. And that long list of verses about the genealogy is really to connect Abram and Sarai with their ancestors. They're continuing a part of an ancestral heritage that was already begun in his father, Terah. Well, to do that, however, they're going to have to leave several things behind. They're going to have to leave the country that now they've known and become familiar with, their actual physical home, and his father's household, and they'll have to set out to this unknown land in this new place, which requires a great deal of trust. And they had no physical evidence for which to do this, just God's word that had come to them. They had to trust in God's covenant and God's promise, and that God would be faithful. And I can imagine that Abram and Sarai, being human, probably had a bit of anxiety about this transition. It is natural for us to feel anxiety in transition. And it's a comfort to me to know that perhaps even the heroes of the Bible struggle with some of the same things that we do. It can be scary to be in transition because we're leaving something we know that's familiar, and we're going to something that might be kind of unknown and unfamiliar. And in between there is this mystery called the unknown. Of course, the mystery is the place where God dwells. That's the place that can be most exciting. And as I was reflecting on this, I was reminded of Margaret Wheatley's book, Leadership and the New Science, which if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it and think it would be a really fun book for us to study together. Because in it, she talks about the new science of chaos theory and how scientists have actually studied weather patterns and and found that normally we define chaos as the lack of order, right? Chaos is disorder. However, scientists now realize there is a pattern in the midst of the chaos. And what seems random, if you track it, there is a thread that goes through all the chaos and comes out the end as a new pattern. The design for the pattern is in the beginning of the chaos. But you have to ride it all the way through to the end until you can see what it is. And that can be so like us in our lives as well. God has a higher purpose. God has a higher plan. We don't always know what it is. So in the middle of the mystery for us, it can feel like chaos. But we have to trust that God has a plan and that God knows what God is doing. And it seems to me that is what God is trying to remind Abram and Sarah of as they move ahead in chapter 15. Now Abram expresses his anxiety. How is this going to happen, God? That's a really great promise, descendants, great, but I don't even have an heir right now. How are we going to get from here to there? Well, then God shows Abram the stars in the sky. And think of the last time you looked at the sky, maybe outside of the city lights. That might be hard to remember. But maybe when you were camping, or if you've gone to Yosemite or somewhere, you look up and it just looks like diamonds in the sky. Or even the time when you've been at the ocean, you've just looked at the vast expanse of the horizon. Don't you feel a little smaller? Don't you feel like you kind of are put in perspective? That maybe your concern or your focus in that moment isn't quite as important. There's a much bigger picture. We're just a speck in a big old galaxy universe. I think that's part of what God was trying to do with Abraham and Sarah. Say, look, you are part of a vast plan and intricate network that is already in place, and I will be with you. Showing Abram and Sarah the stars helped them gain perspective on what was happening. And Rene Rico reminded us that in the Alba Institute, they call that balcony space. Stepping out to the balcony in a way to get perspective on our lives rather than just being caught up in the day-to-day tasks. That is where God reminds us of God's vision. Sometimes if we're in the middle of stress or whatever our transition is, we just need to get a little balcony space to help us remember God's presence with us. Well, that can be true in any kind of transition we face, job transition, daily transition. It can be true, of course, if we go through a pastoral transition as well. And it would be normal that there's a whole variety of feelings that a congregation would have when we go through a pastoral transition. And I think it's fascinating because I was part of the interim ministry network for quite a while, and that's where I got to know David Moat and had a variety of dear colleagues. And one of my dear colleagues is here this morning, Reverend George Gilchrist, one of the ones in the bicycle outfit there. And he's actually where I learned this phrase, mad, sad, glad. And I couldn't believe, I watched him walk up the stairs this morning, I'm like, George, I'm using some of your material this morning. But there's this phrase, mad, sad, glad. And it really is just to connotate that in any congregation in a pastoral transition, we will probably have a variety of feelings. Some might be mad that the last pastor left. Some might be sad, and some might be glad. Not necessarily that they left, but about the new thing that's happening. Now, that can be true from an interim pastor to an installed pastor as well. And I can imagine that it might be a little bit more of 2 and 3. So we kind of have a fourth. It's a combo of 2 and 3. Because you have had an excellent interim pastor. Reverend David Moat is incredible. I feel so amazingly honored to be following his ministry because he did actual interim work, which makes me really excited. And I can appreciate that because I've done interim work. And so it would be, and he was with you for 3 years, that's a long time. So it would make sense that there might be a little grief with that there might be a little sadness. It also makes sense that you might be excited about the future and what's coming. And that you might even have a combination of both. And we don't talk about things like that very often, but I think it's possible to hold the paradox, that both can be true at the same time. And one doesn't cancel the other out. You might be a little bit sad about the thing that's ending and excited about the thing that's beginning, and both can be true. So I just want to hold that and name that and give permission for a variety of feelings and responses as we walk through this transition together.